how can a snare drum fit a song? It's just a sound, you hit something with a stick.
Do you base your decision purely on taste, or are there any other sort of parameters that you take into account when choosing the snare?
Snare taste is really subjective. It's not something where you can objectively say it's good or bad. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not just a snare drum. It's the snare drum close mic plus all the other mics around the kit that capture the snare.
So, what's your opinion on the Saint Anger's snare sound?
Okay, I have an unpopular opinion probably.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go.
Are you truly happy with your snare sound? I kind of doubt it because, as we all know, snares tend to sound like shit. And it's this ongoing, meme on the internet where, snares just suck and everybody's complaining about their snare sound and how hard it is to get it right. Yet there are so many records out there that have amazing sounding snare sounds. And the snare is, for whatever reason, in rock and pop, especially rock, is almost kind of the second voice of a song in a way. There's the lead vocal, that's most of the time the most important thing, but then right after that, people tend to pay attention to the snare. It is a very important aspect of any production that defines the character of a mix. That's super important. That is usually pretty loud in a mix. And I don't know what it is, but for me as well, if I listen to a new rock record or heavy record or something like that, I pay attention to the snare immediately and it either works or it doesn't for me. So we're going to talk about that today and about a couple of things that you can do to make your snares sound better and finally fix some of the problems that you're probably having with your snare drums. And there are two main things that we're going to cover today, and we're going to show you audio examples as well. And that is snare EQ and the fact that a snare drum in a rock context is not just the snare drum channel, the snare drum mic, or the sample, or whatever you choose. It is the combination of that plus the overheads plus the room mics on a kit. And most people focus too much on the snare track or the channel or whatever and try to EQ and compress the hell out of it, when in reality, it is a combination of all those things that I just mentioned. And so we're going to dive into that. We're also going to talk about situations where you don't have overheads and rooms and a snare close mic, where maybe you just work with an isolated individual snare sample. Maybe it's a one-shot that has everything baked into it. Maybe it's not even a real kit, it's just programmed. So we're going to talk about that as well. And we're going to try and make snare EQ and the balancing of the different snare sources that you have. We're going to make that, try and make that as easy as possible for you, clarify a few things, simplify a few things, and show you how that all actually works. So if you master those two things, you're going to be probably at least 80% there, because yes, there's compression, there's saturation, and all these other things you can do. But if you get the EQ right, if you find a good volume for the snare, and if you find a good balance of all the different snare sources that might be in your mix, it will already sound pretty great. And there might be another episode on just the snare compression part, but those two things will get you very far. Okay, so my name is Benedikt Hein. I'm a mixing engineer. I run a mixing studio called Outback Recordings. We mix a lot of songs every year, hundreds of them. And I've been doing that for the past 10 to 15 years. I always forget how long it's actually been. It's closer to 15 years. And all the things that I've learned from this long time of making records, I'm sharing with you on this podcast. And I don't do this on my own. I do this with my friend and co-host and fantastic music producer from Spain, Manel Espinosa Berenguer. Hello. How are you, my friend?
Hi, guys. I'm doing great as always, every time. And now that you've introduced the topic of memes, I'm gonna talk to you about something related to that.
Awesome.
But first, guys, just in case you don't know me, I'm Manel Espinosa. I'm a music producer and mixing engineer from Spain, and I enjoy making great songs with great artists, basically.
Awesome. Great. Yes, you do. Very happy to do this with you. So if you're new to the show, welcome. If you're already a listener, welcome back. If you're new, there are 260 something episodes that we've already done that you can go into and binge listen to all of them. I highly encourage you to do that. There's a lot of stuff out there already, and we've been doing this for quite a while. But yeah, if you want to make better recordings from your jam spaces and home studios, you are in the right place. And if you're looking for people to collaborate with on your music, here are two people that are happy to do that with you if you think that we can help you make better sounding stuff. Anyway, tell me about the meme, Manel.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
So, I mean, this is a little funny anecdote. It's not going to be so long like in the last episode. So I had a double gig again this weekend.
Yeah.
So, yeah, first I had a 2 hours gig in a trio format. So I was playing guitar and singing with my cover band, right? Mm-hmm. I play in a cover band for you guys, if you don't know it. And then 1 hour later, I had another 2 hours gig in a quartet format, right? It was the same songs, the same band, but quartet format. And when we do that, I don't sing. I only play guitar and I do some backing vocals, but the most of it's a singer that only sings, right? Mm-hmm. So, and by having those two experiences also in the same day, I noticed how precise memes are, The singers get all the attention.
Yeah.
I went from having all the attention as a guitar player and singer in the first gig to just be a normal guy in the second one.
Yeah, it's true.
It's funny, I think.
Yeah, but you're not playing bass, right? That's the worst.
No, but it's the coolest. I don't know why people don't get it.
Bass is the best. Yeah, I don't know. Bass players are like, nobody cares about the bass players. It's like it's the singers, and then for whatever reason, the drummers oftentimes. And then
if people know that the bass is a bass, that's something already.
Yeah. Totally. You're absolutely right there. Yeah. So, no fame for you this weekend, unfortunately.
Only on the first gig.
On the
second gig, I was just the guy playing the solos, but that's not cool anymore. So
solos are not cool anymore. That's how far we've come, guys. Like guitar solos are not cool anymore. Yeah, man.
Yeah. But I always say that if I were to start again, I would play bass.
Really?
Yeah, they get tons of gigs.
Is it like that? I don't know. Maybe I should look for that.
Yeah. Like,
no, I'm not interested
at least
in
here, bassists play in 4 or 5 bands at the same time because there are not enough bassists. So
yeah. Many bassists are not. The thing is, it's hard to find good bassists because a lot of bass players do what I did when I joined my band. Almost. Yeah, it's been more than 20 years ago. God. It's like they are oftentimes guitar players and somebody says, oh man, you can play guitar, you probably can also play bass. And then they play bass like guitar players, which is not the same thing, and which is exactly what I've done. But it took me a while for me to understand the role of the bass in a song, even in heavy music. And so a lot of bass players out there are not really bass players. They're just guitarists trying to play bass.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Or frustrated guitarists.
Yeah.
Guitarists.
Yeah. I swear we're going to get into the episode. The cool thing about playing bass for me is just that I can, I only have one string to use at a time, and I can like move around, and I go pretty crazy on stage. And with a guitar, I would just have to stand there. Like I've never played guitar on the stage, but I imagine I would have to look at what I'm doing and be super focused. And with the bass, it doesn't even matter. Like I just, it's fun to play bass for me, and people don't even notice some of the things I do. Anyway, let's talk about snares, not the bass. Yeah. So, Manel, I know that you, again, on the whole genre topic, I don't want to really get into this, but still, I know that in my world, I most often work with drum kits. They might be programmed sometimes, but it's still a drum kit with all the usual mics around a kit and all of that. Very rarely is there a song where it's just percussion samples or drum samples that are not really an image of a real kit. But in some of the stuff you do, I guess it doesn't always have to be an image of a real drum kit. It can just be a kick and a snare and some hi-hats or whatever. And so there's probably a difference there. So how often do you even have to worry about making the snare work with other tracks that also have snare sounds in it?
Oh, how often?
Is that often the case? Or is it mostly just one snare track for you? That's basically the question.
Lately, it's pretty often, because when I use like, how do you say, like digital drum kits, at the end, the point of using them well is that it recreates the sound of a real drum kit. So you're going to have the snare everywhere. But of course, you have the option to turn down the snare in the bleed channels or whatever. So it's easier, I guess. So normally I don't have to deal with that like too much, I would say. I don't have to fix that many things, because if I don't like the snare, I just pick a different snare instead of like fixing the one that I have, right?
Yeah, totally. So, that's how it all starts. Yeah, it's a totally good thing you bring that up. So I would say before we even get into the mixing stuff for snare, we just have to start at the source, actually, which is exactly what you just said. So it starts by picking the right snare drum. And that is true whether you're sampling or doing real drums. You have to pick the right drum, the right size of drum, the right shell material, the right tuning. If it's samples and you don't know which drum it actually is, then just listen and pick the one that works with the song. And I remember when I started out, that was hard for me to do. When mentors that I had back then were telling me that snare drum doesn't fit the song, I was like, how can a snare drum fit a song? It's just a sound. You hit something with a stick, it makes a noise. Like that was not musical to me, and it didn't really seem to matter. But now I realize it absolutely does matter. It has a different vibe, different character. So might be hard to learn for you in the beginning, but just the best thing you can do is just listen to a lot of songs and pay attention to the snare, pay attention to how high or low the tuning is, how long the sustain is, how hard the attack is or how soft it sounds, how much rattle there is, if it's dry or if there's a ring to it, like all these things. Pay attention to that, and you'll figure out your personal taste and what you actually like about snare drums and what works well for you and your taste in different songs. And then start by picking the right snare. That is always where it starts. The next thing would then be to pick the right way of playing that. So if it's a real drummer, how hard do you hit? Where do you hit the snare drum? It's going to sound different in the center versus hitting it on the side of the snare drum. The consistency. If you program, the velocities matter. Like it's really, if those things are wrong, everything we're going to tell you in this episode is not going to matter. So pick the right snare and play it the right way so that in the room next to the drum kit, it already sounds amazing. Or when you program and you choose a sample without you doing anything to it, it should already work. And if it doesn't work, choose a different snare, like Manel said, before you go in and fix things. So that's how it starts.
So one question, just to clarify. When you choose your snare, even if it's a real snare or digital snare that has been recorded previously or whatever, do you base your decision purely on taste, or are there any other sort of parameters that you take into account when choosing the snare?
Very good question. So for me, it's always taste, but there are a few things that I specifically pay attention to where I just discovered that for my taste, a few things work and others not so much. And it's not just me, it seems to be the case for a lot of people. So the things I pay attention to is this. So for example, it is the speed of the song and how dense the arrangement is. Like if it's a slower song and it's like open chords and a lot of room in between chords and not like busy shredding and or busy arrangements, then there might be more room for a longer snare decay. You can have you can give the snare a nice, beautiful length and some audible ring even, and it's not annoying. It's just going to fill out the space in between everything else. Whereas, and in those cases, if you choose a very dry, short, and snappy snare, it can sound a little small and empty if it's just a little transient, and you want to fill those gaps. So that's one thing. On the other hand, if it's a technical death metal song with blast beats, it might not make sense to have a really long, ringy snare, and it might have to be more precise. So That is one thing. The other thing is the tuning of the snare in terms of where the fundamental is. It's to a degree, it's a genre thing, but also personal taste. So the classic examples would be, if you imagine a classic like funk snare drum, it's probably a little higher, might have a ring to it. If it's a 70s super dry disco whatever snare, then it can be tuned down to 150 hertz or so, and maybe there's a towel over it and all you hear is this fat, very low impact sound. And there are certain things that just certain styles, but in a normal rock song, I start with one of the tried and true classics. It could be something like a Ludwig Black Beauty, which is the most recorded snare, I think, out there, or some standard like 14 by 6.5 snare drum, either wood or metal, like one of the common models, basically. And it requires a little bit of knowledge about drums, but like there are some specific models that just tend to work really well for certain things. I start there. I start with a tuning where the fundamental is around 200 hertz, and then from there, I go up or down, depending on things like the speed of the song, how heavy the song is, the aesthetic I'm going for, the taste of the band, of course, most importantly. But yeah, it's hard to describe. I have certain genres or sounds or textures in mind where, to me, a low-tuned fat snare just works, and others where a higher ringy snare works, and some where a snappy, hard transient works, and others where a softer transient works. And that comes from listening to a lot of music and building my taste, really. But I definitely, there are a few of these things that I specifically pay attention to. Yeah, no hard rules, but yeah.
Okay, and there's a question that I have to bring up because we're talking about snares.
Yeah.
So, like, what's your opinion on the Saint Anger's snare sound?
Okay, I have an unpopular opinion, probably. I think it's really fucking cool because. Not because I think the snare on its own sounds fantastic or whatever, but the fact that they made this bold decision and everyone's talking about it and it's the signature sound of this record and the record did really well. That just is something I like. And I'd rather make exciting, unique, wild records than making safe and boring decisions. And so, I don't know. And Metallica has always done things like that. They have a record where there's no bass on it, basically, or barely any bass. They have records where in the 90s, at a time where nobody did that, they had super clicky, polished like drums that defined what would later turn into, modern metalcore sounds and stuff like that. They always had this like new thing that nobody else did. They made what was the loudest record ever at the time with Death Magnetic. They always made these like crazy decisions that everyone was going was discussing about and nobody seemed to like, but for whatever reason all of these records did really well. And I don't know, that's just exciting to me. So if I listen to Saint Anger, and I remember when it came out and this video in the prison video and all of that back then, I heard that song and I just thought, wow, that sounds like unhinged and wild and crazy. And I was laughing about the snare drum, but I also thought it's cool. So I never really complained about it. That's my honest opinion. How do you feel about that?
I haven't, like, I listened to a couple of songs, but I don't have an opinion really. Like,
yeah,
I mean, it sounds weird, of course.
Yeah,
but yeah, I don't know.
Anyway, so snares are really objective, really subjective. In like, or like snare taste is really subjective. It's not something where you can objectively say it's good or bad. That's what I'm trying to say. So yeah, but let's go further into this. The next thing, after you've chosen the right snare and you play it the right way and all those things, the next thing that really matters is phase, as always with drums. We have an entire episode on this, so I won't go too far into this, but if the phase doesn't work between your snare top and snare bottom, or between the snare close mics and the overheads, you're going to have a hard time. It's going to be impossible to get a good punchy snare, so always get the phase and polarity right. Listen to our episodes on that and check that out. You can always go to the selfrecordingband.com/podcast, and then there's a search, little search thing there. If you type phase there, you'll find the episodes. So very, very important to understand the concept of phase and polarity. Now, the next thing is what I mentioned in the beginning. It's the the fact that a snare drum is not just, in many cases at least when it's a real drum kit, it's not just a snare drum, it's the snare drum close mic plus all the other mics around the kit that capture the snare. Because you have to imagine, if you record drums, and also if it's sampled drums, somebody recorded real drums with microphones, and that's what your sampler is playing back. So it's the same thing. If you record drums, there's a microphone on the snare, maybe two, one at the top, one at the bottom. And then there are all the other mics around the drum kit, and all of them will capture the snare because the snare is loud and it's going to be in all of those mics. And especially the overheads and the rooms are really important for snare sound because unlike what many people think, overheads are not just cymbal mics. We have an entire episode on that, by the way, too. Overheads capture the image of the entire kit, and no matter what you do, there's going to be shells in that, and that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. And if you program drums, a lot of people turn the shells off in the overheads and treat them just like cymbal mics, when in reality that makes it often sound really disconnected. So try to keep your snares and shells in those overheads in most situations. It's just part of what a drum kit sounds like. So the overheads add this first layer of depth and length and size to the snare because there is a time delay between the close mic and the overheads, and it makes the snare a little longer and nicer. And when you listen to drums, in reality, your ear is not attached to the snare drum. You listen to it from a distance. So you hear the space around the drums, and the snare sound is the explosiveness that comes back from the walls and all of that. So this excitement. So it starts with the overheads. And then there's the room mics, which are super important. In some genres or some styles, you might want to have a really, really dry kit with no room mics at all. But in many cases, there's at least going to be a little bit of room mics. And what people often think is reverb on drums is oftentimes not reverb. It's just room mics that get compressed really hard, and you get a nice ambience. It sounds like the drummer is hitting harder. It's the energy. So especially in heavy music and rock, I get that all the time, that people ask, what is that reverb that they used on the snare? And in many, many cases, I'm like, this is not a reverb at all. It's just a great sounding room. Maybe it's compressed a lot, so it sounds even more exciting. But a reverb often sounds like an effect, whereas the room sounds like part of the performance, makes it longer, more explosive and awesome. And so don't treat room mics or overheads as cymbal mics or anything like that. Treat it as part of your drum sound, especially the snare drum sound. Toms, also important. The kick sometimes gets a little isolated there. In many mixes, you hear a pretty dry, separate kick because some people don't like the kick in the rooms or the overheads. Not always the same, but maybe the kick's a little more isolated, but especially snare and toms in rooms and overheads, super important. So I want to show you what I'm actually talking about here. So Manel, I have a couple of examples prepared here for us, and I'm going to start with, let me check this real quick. So I'm going to start with a full kit that has all the mics running, going, and we hear a combination of the close mics plus the overheads plus the rooms. And then I'm going to show you what it sounds like if you turn off the rooms, or if you turn off rooms and overheads, and we're only left with close mics. And I want you to pay attention, you listening to this, I want you to pay attention to specifically the snare sound. Everything else changes too, but on this episode we focus on the snare. So there's no different EQ, there's no different compression or anything. The only thing that changes between these examples is what mics are on and off. So we have the full kit, we have only close mics and overheads, and then we have only the dry or the pure like close mics. And now listen to how that changes the snare sound drastically. So full kit is coming up. So that was a full kit. Now let's remove the overheads. Everything else stays exactly the same levels, everything.
Hi guys, it's Manel here, and I wanted to let you know that Benny made a little mistake in this part. He meant that he removed the room mics in the next example instead of the overheads. And I wanted to tell you just to make sure that you don't get confused with this. And now, keep enjoying the podcast.
I don't think I have to play the whole thing. It's pretty clear and obvious. So back and forth, kit, and then a full drum kit again. So this is just close mic plus overheads. And the full kit. It's not just that it gets roomier, it's also there's a lot of bottom to the snare drum, a lot of punch. And do you realize, maybe it's just me, but the snare sounds so much ringier when it's only kit, like only overheads and close mics. The overtones are much more dominant, and with the room, they become part of the sound more, and it sounds more roomy, but dry also in the sense that there's less overtones.
Yeah.
And now let's remove all of that and just listen to the close mics. So just the snare channel and the close mics that most people focus on when they dial in their snare sound. Pretty ringy, and it's cool. There's everything we need in the snare drum, but this is the reason why many people, when they prefer drier sounds and they don't like the ring and the overtones, that they do way too much in terms of muffling and dampening the snare, because they listen to the close mic and think, oh my God, this is so ringy and I need to get rid of all these overtones, and then they make it super dead and dry, because they don't realize that when you add the rest of it, and then especially the full arrangement and the band, there's not much left of those overtones. And if you kill them all, then you're just left with a boring transient, and it won't cut through the mix. If I add back all the other mics, and then if you add guitars and all of that, the ring is not a problem at all anymore. So this snare that might sound really ringy to you right now is a very common normal rock snare that in the context of a full mix doesn't sound ringy at all. And I hear it so often that people completely kill their snare tones because they just pay attention to what it sounds with your ear directly at the shell, basically.
Yeah.
So one more time, I start with close mics only, then I add the overheads, and then I add the full kit. The amount of energy is crazy, and it just the rock snare drum sound that we love and know from so many records is never just the close mic. It's always this combination. There's no reverb on it. It's just those different mics. And if you kill all your snare stuff in the overheads and rooms, and when you're programming drums, you'll never get that sound, no matter what you do. You can compress it hard, you can EQ, you can add reverb. It's never going to sound like that. Also, the stereo width, the close mics are just mono, narrow up here, and then the overheads add this layer of width and depth to it, and then the rooms make it really wide, and it's just no comparison in terms of energy and size and depth.
Yeah. So I guess, like, in general terms, we should always try to mix in context as much as possible.
Context is everything. I'm so glad you say that. We don't mix snare drums. We don't mix kick drums. We don't even mix drums. We mix a song. And and you have a lot of channels to do that. And it's always the combination of all of these channels that create a certain vibe. And it's never just a single thing that you should focus on. It's always context. Yeah, absolutely right. Yes. And even just changing the balance between those elements will have such a big difference on your mix, and you should get that right before you even touch EQ and compression. Same thing is when you EQ overheads also. Before you get rid of all the low end, or before you tame the cymbals and all that, like, don't do that in isolation. Do it with the other mics on. Do it in context. If I listen to overheads only and I try to make the overheads, focus on the cymbals more, and I make them less rumbly, muddy, or whatever, and I don't have the other tracks on, I don't know if it still sounds like a drum kit. I want to hear the entire thing. So don't do it in solo. You can check every once in a while in solo, but listen to the drums and ideally the whole mix when you make decisions like that. It's always about context. So Manel, how do you accomplish these things like width, depth, size, energy when you don't have a full drum kit, but you create a song where you just choose a snare and that's your track? do you choose samples that have all of that already in the sample? Do you do it with effects, or what is the approach there when you work with not like a real drum kit or something that creates the image of a real drum kit?
I normally have a bus that's called drum room or something like that. I don't remember the exact name. And I send things through there. That's one thing I do. And
what is on that bus? What on that? Is it an effects return? Is it a reverb or IR or something like that? Or
yeah, I think it's a reverb or an IR. I'm not sure right now, but yeah, it recreates the sound of a room.
So you have that in your template basically, and you can send things through there. Awesome. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say that's pretty much it. Like when I make music that doesn't require the sound of a real drum kit, and it doesn't matter if it's a real like played by a person or a digital thing made to recreate a person. I'm talking about drums that are not recreating a drum kit. I don't know how to express this.
Yeah. I know what you mean. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. Yeah.
But what I tend to do is creative things like using sounds that are not drums, like real drums. Like, for example, not too long ago, I used a sound that I recorded from an automatic door that people have in their garage.
Yeah.
So I went to my uncle's place and recorded his automatic door. Yeah.
It's awesome.
And so then when you hear that, it's kind of like does something like that. So yeah, I do stuff like that. So I guess it's kind of like making it longer,
Yeah. So you capture. Yeah. That's awesome. You do like field recordings and weird samples that you turn into drum sounds, basically. So
yeah, I do
because
that
you don't care
time.
about it being a real kit, anyways, in those cases, and then you just do whatever gives you. It's interesting because you do whatever gives you the vibe and the texture you're going for. So if you need something long, you find something that has a long sound that's cool and unique. If you need something that's a hard transient, you could hit something and record that, or whatever. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you can do that also with a real drum kit. You can add some like things, And also I use, this is for the kick, but I use also like the sound of a calculator. I have a calculator that probably sounds like the keyboard. So when we talk about, keyboard sounding kicks, I mean, you can get that with a real keyboard sound.
You mean the typewriter sound, basically, the clicky? Yeah.
So yeah, stuff like that I do sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Layering samples just to make it sound like that. And so you can get realistic sounding drum sounds even with that. So I remember doing a live talk once on stage where I made the audience create samples with their body, drum samples with their body, and then just recorded it with a phone and then put it on the computer, and we turned it into an actual drum groove, and it sounded like drums. So we just, hit our chest with the fist, and we did some, whatever, clap. I think people were smacking each other like in the face, and doing like clap sounds and snare sounds like that, and it was super fun. And then hitting the table with a pen, and then so we put together the attack sound with a little longer sound and all those things, and we created a drum groove from just sounds that we made with our bodies in the room. So it's totally possible.
Yeah. And have you ever had these moments where you hit a table or whatever, and you're like, wow, this table sounds so cool.
Yeah, I absolutely have these moments. Yes, I absolutely do. Oh, yeah. We are weirdos. But if you are producing music all day, you pay attention to those things. You recognize cool sounds where you're like, oh, that could be whatever. Hi-hat, Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. So back to context. Mixing. The next couple of examples that I have are all EQ examples because, like I said, balancing the different mics is one thing. The next big thing you can do is EQ, or the thing that people get wrong with snare drums is that they don't know how to EQ them properly, and oftentimes they do too much or just the wrong things. So I want to share with you how I think about snare drum EQ, similar to what we did on the kick drum episode, by the way. If you want to listen to that, go back and listen to that. It's just a couple episodes ago. And my goal is to help you be intentional with your EQ moves with the snare drum. So you need to know why the snare sounds the way it does, and when there's something that bothers you, what you can do to fix that, solve that, or change it in any way, shape, or form. So it's never just trying an EQ curve that you see someone else do. It's about listening first, then thinking, do I like what I hear? And if I'm not sure, I can compare it to references. And then it's about being able to identify whatever I want to change, and then knowing how exactly to change that. And that's what I'm trying to help you with now. So the way I think about a snare drum is there is stuff below the fundamental frequency of the snare drum that is sometimes useful as extra weight, but oftentimes it's just rumble. And again, context, you have to figure that out. So let's say the snare drum is tuned so that the fundamental is at 200 hertz, which is very common for a rock snare drum. It's usually between 150, which would be on the very low end of it, and can be up to whatever 300, which would be really high and funky, whatever. So between there, it usually sits, and in most cases, I would say around 200-ish. So there's the fundamental. It's the body, the weight of the snare. It's the what sounds big, punchy, heavy, and dark in a snare drum, and without being muddy or boxy. So it's the if you look at an analyzer, when a snare drum is playing, you see that around there, wherever the fundamental is, you'll see a relatively narrow peak that just goes up every time you hit the snare drum. It's the loudest of the snare drum frequencies. That is your fundamental. And so below that, oftentimes we can just clean things up. So if it's at 200, you can try a low cut from like 100 down or so, because the low cut I wouldn't go up to sometimes I go up to the fundamental. You have to try, but try getting rid of the stuff below and see if it makes things better. If it doesn't change anything, don't do it. You don't have to put a low cut on the snare drum. If there's nothing bothering you, don't do it. If there's kick drum bleed or any other rumble that you don't like, clean it up. A little bit of a filter, like a low cut, also adds a bit of resonance at the point where you're filtering. So if you go up to 200 with your low cut, you're not just cutting the lows, you're also going to be boosting the 200 a little bit, because there will be a filter resonance. So sometimes that can be cool. You're getting rid of the rumble and at the same time adding more emphasis to the actual fundamental. So that's the first step, checking if below the fundamental there is anything that bothers you that needs taking care of. And oftentimes it's not, so just leave it alone. Next thing you need to know is when you do things like that, it changes, again, the phase. So when you do a low cut or when you do any kind of drastic EQ changes, always after you've done that, try flipping the phase on your snare and see if it's still in phase with the overheads. Because, for example, if you don't filter the overheads, but you filter the snare drum, that might put it out of phase. It can switch the polarity. That's what filters and EQs do. So sometimes after applying a steep low cut, you have to flip the polarity for it to work again. So just a heads up there. Sometimes also not. Always depends. Cool. So the rest of it is easier. Filters can be kind of complex. The rest of it is a little easier. So after we cleaned up below the fundamental, we listen to the fundamental itself. So does the snare have enough body? Is it too thin and we want it to be thicker, fuller, punchier on the bottom end? Or is it too boomy, tubby, and just too thick and it needs to be a little, thinner to just work well in the mix? So this is the next question we're going to ask ourselves. And I have 3 examples here. The first one, again, is our full kit, and it's all in context. It's not an isolated snare drum. Like I said, the whole kit matters. So we listen to the whole kit flat, and then we listen to it where I boosted the fundamental quite a bit, and then on the next one, I cut the fundamental. And you can make a decision what you would prefer in this context. It's not a full mix context text because I wanted to make it easier for you to hear it, but depending on the full song, we could now make a decision. Do we want the flat snare sound? Do we want the big, fat body snare sound? Or do we want a thinner snare sound? So here we go. This is the flat kit. Boost. And cut. So once again, without me talking, full kit, then 200 hertz boosted, and then 200 hertz cut. Did you hear the difference in the body?
Yeah.
No right or wrong. It's just about being intentional and picking whatever works with the song. It's just, if you do it right and you focus narrow enough on the fundamental, but broad enough for it to be musical, then you can change how big the snare sounds without making it muddy, without bringing up the nasty overtones above it. It's just how much of the body do you want? Very important thing you can control in a mix.
Mm-hmm.
All right. The next one is higher, a little higher up. That's around, in this case, it always depends on the snare. In this case, I chose 500 hertz now as the next frequency because this is where, to me, the muddy, boxy, and cheap-sounding overtones and just the cheap-sounding shell sound of this snare drum really lives. So to me, if there's too much of that, it sounds like a cheap basement recording. And if it's not enough, though, it can sound a little thin and maybe doesn't cut through the mix. So there's a balance again. But just so you know what the next frequency area does. So I'm talking about, depending on the snare, it can be anything between 400 and 800 or so. Usually somewhere there is oftentimes the crappy basement sound kind of thing. And maybe it's cool in some for some genres. It's also cool. But in a lot of cases, I tend to clean that up a little bit. But I'll let you decide. So in this case, it was 500. Flat. Boosted. And cut. So once again, all three. Almost sounds like a different snare drum. Got a lot drier on the last example where I cut it. And how much of that, and it might sound cool on its own with like none of that in basically, but maybe it's also not enough anymore. Maybe it doesn't cut through without enough of that. So is that something you ever deal with when you choose, like electronic samples or samples you come up with yourself? Is because to me, this is a typical thing that happens in a room with real snare drums in a way. And I only EQ'd the snare close mic in all these examples, by the way. So it is everything that we're listening to, but the EQ is only on the snare channel. The overheads and rooms are the same always in all these examples. I'm just changing the snare itself, the close mic. So, but is this something where if you just choose an electronic sample, is there this muddy, mid-rangey, cheap thing oftentimes that you need to clean up, or is that usually where it's supposed to be?
Yeah, I don't think it's that much of a problem normally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I normally focus more on like clicky stuff that I don't like. And sometimes if I think it needs more highs to but yeah, that normally it's not a problem, I would say.
Yeah, same for me. I'm just mixing a pop record right now where we use a lot of electronic samples, and I've done a lot of that in my career. And almost every single time, what I focus on is what you just said. It's the body, it's the attack, the brightness, and the click sounds. And I either boost or cut there if it's too much or not enough. But in general, everything in between is usually the way it is. And kind of, if you boost body and top, then in a way, you're already taming the mid-range also. So sometimes I just boost my way out of this problem. So yeah, but I agree. The typical nasty, cardboardy, cheap sound is happening in real recordings in real rooms most of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, like a couple months ago, I mixed a real drum kit, and basically I had to remove the real snare. And change it for another one because I just thought it wasn't the best one for the song. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It happens all the time. It's not the end of the world, and sometimes it's even better to remove it. Like it's really better to remove it entirely and replace it instead of trying to add a sample to what's already there. Sometimes we try. In the past, I sometimes tried to keep the original sound because I just wanted to respect the artist and what they gave me, and I always do that. But sometimes it's just better for the end result if you just remove it and replace it and not keep it just because you think you have to, because if it's bad, it's bad, and it's not going to get much better even if you add another one on top of it. So yeah, it's the reality sometimes. Okay, full kit again, and then we're talking about the next frequency area, which in this case I chose 2 kilohertz. So we went from below the fundamental, the rumble, then we went to the fundamental, which is the thickness in the body. Then we went above the fundamental in the low mid-range, which is often the cardboardy, cheap stuff, and can also be the character of the snare, so I'm not saying it's always bad. Now we're getting into stick attack and presence and how the snare cuts through the mix. And so we're talking about mid-range, upper mid-range now, 2 kilohertz. Listen to what that sounds like and what that does to you. So full kit, then boost, then cut, 2 kilohertz. Relatively broad, all of these, by the way. So again, the last two, one is boost and then the cut. So this is boosted. Again, not right or wrong. The cut sounds a little cleaner in a way, but also might not cut through a mix. And the boost sounds more present, but also has, at least to me, a little bit of a psh, psh sound to it that I don't really like. It sounds a little too much and unnatural almost. But maybe if there's a wall of guitars that have a lot of presence around 2 kilohertz, maybe that's what it needs. That's why context is so important. On its own, I would prefer the flat one, or maybe even cut it a little bit. But in a rock mix, I could see me boost that because the guitars will be very present there and the snare might be drowning in the guitars, right? So do you also feel that kind of like slightly annoying presence in the length of the shell?
Yeah, to me it felt like the one that was boosted sounded like closer. Mm-hmm. And it also sounded to me like if the drummer was playing harder, like with more aggression. Like
more stick attack, yeah. Definitely closer. And if you cut it, the snare was being pushed back into the rooms more. It became one with the rooms more. Yeah, you're right. So the next area is 5 kilohertz. That's and I'm not saying you have to EQ by these exact numbers, by the way. It's roughly the area. So I'm dividing it into low end, low mids, like fundamental, then low mids, then upper mids, and now we're getting into top end territory. And so roughly these ranges. But it's important for you to realize where to look at and what to do when you hear certain problems. So for example, if the snare does too much of the psh sound for you, somewhere in the upper mid-range, that's where you need to look and tame that. If it's too far back and not present enough and it doesn't cut through, that's where you have to boost maybe. So that's the whole point. So now we're going a little higher to the presence area, around 5K. Again, helpful for making the snare cut through, but also it makes it just bright. Maybe too bright, maybe too dark, we'll see. So I'm going to do flat and then boost and then cut. 5K. Again, very different, even more obvious and bright than the 2K. And pay attention to the snares at the bottom of the snare. I'm going to start with the cut and then switch to boost. Pay attention to the rattle and the sound of the snares. It's like you turned up the snare bottom mic all of a sudden.
Yeah. Like what's the name of, how do you call this thing that the snares have on the bottom, like this?
It's called the snares.
Oh.
Or snare wires. Yeah, snare
Okay,
wires.
snare
yeah.
wires. Okay, it sounds like if you were like changing the, the pressure of the snare wires into the thing. Yeah.
Yeah, they sound more open, longer. Yeah. So again, like you see, and by the way, these are drastic boosts. So we're talking a difference of 16 dB. So I boosted 8 dBs and I cut 8 dBs. So there's a 16 dB difference there. And both of those settings could work depending on the context of the mix. That's why I'm saying there's no right or wrong. It's all about context and personal taste and knowing what to do and being intentional. And sometimes it takes a 10 or 20 dB boost. And, but just so you know, without hearing the song, I cannot tell you if any of these settings is better or worse. They could all work. I just want to show you what is possible and where to go and look for certain frequencies, certain characters and the frequency spectrum, basically. So yeah, 5 kilohertz makes it sound like almost like a whip to me, like a even more aggressive than the 2 kilohertz, and it makes the snares come forward. But it's also just brightness in general. And if you cut it, again, the snare sounds a little softer. It sounds a little more back in the mix. It becomes one with the room mics. It sounds a little more distant. So that can also be a great way for you to pull the snare out of the mix or push it into the mix and create the kind of depth you want by changing that. Okay, and then finally, the next one is the true upper top end. This is a shelf now. So the rest were like bell boosts on the EQ. The next one is a shelf. It's 8K and above. And I'm boosting 10 dBs and I'm cutting 10 dBs, so really drastic, 20 dBs difference. 8K and above. And I like shelves on EQs, on snares often because they tend to open up the top end in a very natural way, in a very musical way. It just gets brighter, but it's not really different in terms of character. The only thing you have to be careful about is that if it's real drums and there's bleed, you will bring up the hi-hat bleed. So you're going to hear that when I switch to the boost, that the hi-hats get louder because I'm only EQing the snare, but there is hi-hats in the snare because they're right next to it. And so if I boost a lot of top end on the snare, it brings up the hi-hats as well. But it also does something to the snare where it sounds more expensive, more open. And yeah, again, depending on context, you might want to crank that high end or maybe not. So decide for yourself. I'm going to start with the flat kit and then boost and then cut. 8 kilohertz and above. So again, cut versus boost. And remember, 20 dBs difference in the shelf. So I start with cut and then boost. Yeah, to me it sounds much more expensive and open with the boost, but context dependent, of course. How do you feel, Manel? How do you feel about, and we're going to do that comparison, how do you feel about the 8K shelf versus the 5K bell brightness we had before? Those both make the snare brighter, but in different ways.
Yeah, like I would say that even that you've boosted like 10K, this last thing is more subtle in a way. Like it's more like, yeah, as you said, it doesn't change as much the character of the thing. Maybe the last one, it's because it's super dark in comparison, but yeah, that's what I would say. It's more subtle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's compare the 5K boost to the 8K boost, because I think If you want to keep the snare sounding kind of the same, but you just want to open it up and make it a little more expensive and just brighter without changing it, then if you go higher, that's the way to go. It brings up the snare wires in a more natural way. And if you want to go for a more aggressive, hard sound that is a little more unnatural, but it makes the snare cut more, then maybe 5K is your friend. But it's definitely different aesthetics. And in many cases, I prefer the top end, 8K and above, and I only go to the 5K, 4K, etc. when I really need to cut through the guitars, because I just prefer that natural sound. But I'll let you, the listeners, decide. So here is, again, I start with 8K boost, and then I go to 5K boost. Just listen to the difference in how the brightness sounds. Both are brighter than the flat one, but totally different. So 8K and then 5K. And back to 8K. And 5 again. Totally different character. Both would be bright and cut through the mix, but in very different ways. So to sum it up, you have rumble below the fundamental, you have the fundamental, you have the cardboardy stuff above the fundamental, then you have stick attack and hardness and forwardness at like in the upper mid range, 1K, 2K, that kind of thing. Then you have the aggressive brightness in like 5K, maybe 4, maybe 6, somewhere there. And then you have the expensive, more open top end at like 7, 8K and above. And if you just know these things and you pay attention to what it sounds like, also maybe compared to some references you like if you haven't built your ears that much yet, then you have a lot of tools available to get really close to what you want. Like you can make the sound in your head happen, and then the rest is deciding how hard it sounds with compression and all that. But just getting the balances right, the phase right, and then that EQ right will give you a snare drum sound that works. And in many, many cases, all you need is like 2 or 3 EQ bands, and that's it. And the cool snare sounds you hear on your favorite records are not the result of crazy techniques and fancy long plug-in chains. It's someone intentionally making decisions, and maybe what you see a lot of times is a little boost at 200, a little cut somewhere in the mid-range, a little boost at the top, done. Just a simple smiley face EQ, like I often say, similar to the kick drum, just in different frequencies. And that's it. And then it's just about maybe some saturation, pushing it into a compressor, those things. But the EQ is really easy. And when I look at sessions of people, though, that don't have that much experience, I see 16 EQ bands and weird dynamic things and multiband compression and whatnot. That is not the key to snare drums. It's really the simple stuff and understanding that and being intentional. Yeah. So I have one more example, Manel, and that is interesting too, because sometimes the snare sound is awesome the way it is, or maybe we shaped it broadly with the moves that I just explained. But there is one thing that's just sticking out that's super annoying to us, and we want to kill that, but we don't want to kill the entire snare. So in this example here, I heard all the time when I was preparing these, I was hearing one ring, one particular frequency that was not musical to me, because we have the fundamental and then we have musically related overtones, resonances and stuff. Harmonics, exactly. And some of them might not be musical. Some of them sound dissonant and are a little distracting, or they are just too much for our taste. And there was one that was bothering me. And it was close to 400, but not really 400. So it was not the octave of the fundamental. It was slightly below that. And it was creating this dissonance between there was the fundamental, then there's the musical harmony to that, or octave. And then slightly below was this dissonant thing that just rang a little longer than the rest and was annoying. And so when that happens, first you identify it. You don't go looking for it on the analyzer. You just hear it if it's a problem. Then when you know there is some problem, like I did today, then you can pull up an analyzer and look at the graph, and then sometimes you see the ring really sticking out. And in this case, you could see the snare moving up and down the entire frequency spectrum. And then there was this one narrow peak close to 400 that just stayed up longer than the rest. It just rang a little longer. And I just thought that might be the one. And I grabbed it and turned it down, and it was the one. And you can very narrowly notch that out. So in that case, you don't do a broad move. You do a very narrow move, specifically sniper, that like frequency there, and just take it out and clean it up. So I'm gonna play the raw, then I'm gonna be playing a boost at this frequency that's really narrow, so you can really hear it, and then I'm gonna do the narrow cut that cleans it up. It's almost like I've dampened the snare, but I haven't. I just EQ'd that one thing out. And again, this means you don't have to use as much dampening and muffling. If there is one thing that's bothering you, you can just correct that narrow thing, but leave the rest intact, and you still have an overtone structure and an open snare that's loud and punchy, bright, but you can target the specific thing that's annoying you. Yeah, I hope this was easy to hear, but I think it was, right? If you compare the boost and the cut... Big difference. And all of a sudden, once you've done that, then make that again. Yeah, exactly. And then when you listen to the unprocessed kit again, you suddenly hear the frequency as well, now that we've isolated it. It wasn't as obvious before, but once you isolate it, you cannot unhear it, basically. So again, context decision. It doesn't mean that it has to bother you in the mix. But yeah, and again, all these EQ moves was just one EQ on my snare top close mic. So it was not it was the snare bus. So my top and close mixed together, and then there's the EQ. So it was not on the overheads, not on the rooms, not on the whole drums. It's only on the snare. But it makes a big difference in context. And maybe this is one final thing that I want to say, though, as well, is that, hold that thought for a moment, Manel. I just want to say that. And that is, if you EQ individual pieces of the kit rather than a snare bus, for example, again, be careful with phase. So that's the reason why I did it on the snare bus here, because if I EQ the snare top separately from the snare bottom, then I create phase and polarity issues. But if I put them together and I EQ them as one snare drum, then I get a cleaner result and I maintain transients better usually. I get less transient smearing. So I always try to combine my samples and close mics and everything that belongs to the close snare drum. I try to combine that first and then process it as one.
Yeah, so what I was going to say is that what you just described is why you should not look at frequencies on the analyzer, because if you start like trying and seeing but by boosting something you hear something, then when you hear it, if you take it out, then you're gonna hear it, but you were not hearing it before, so you're like tricking yourself, right? So the process has to be first you hear something that you don't like, and then you look for that on the analyzer or whatever way you want. But you need to hear it first. If you don't hear anything, don't do anything.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, exactly. You will hear the problems once you go boosting and hunting for problems, and then you will correct things that are not really there. And yeah. You know what's awesome, Manel, is I often go on these long monologues and rants about things, and then you patiently listen, and then you distill it down to the one important thing that I actually said, and you just add the stuff that I should have said but didn't, and you just bring it to the point. It's awesome. Yeah, you're totally right. This is exactly the whole point. Yeah, I love that. Also, by the way, it's not just us preaching that. If you listen to any experienced mixer, they will tell you the same. And I've been on like just earlier this week or last week at the time, because this one will be out next week. So what I'm about to say happened last week if you're listening to this now. Anyway, I've been on the on the Working Class Audio podcast. So if you're familiar with that, it's a pretty big, well-known podcast done by the host, Matt Boudreau, an amazing producer, engineer. And we talked about common mistakes that self-recording bands oftentimes make. And so he asked me what I think our common mistakes are. And I said one of them is that people try too many, complex things and build crazy plug-in chains instead of being intentional and learning a couple of basics first and all that. And then he said, this way of mixing that people often do these days is like fascinating to him, or like it blows his mind that people think about mixing like that, because what every good mixer, experienced mixer has always done and still does is listen and then making a decision if something needs to be done or not. And that's all of it. You listen, you identify a problem or something that could be better, and then you do it intentionally. And what a lot of people do is they listen, don't really know what to listen for, then try the 16 different techniques they've seen on YouTube and see if something sounds better. And oftentimes they make things worse, or they go hunting for problems until they find one, basically. But it's very rare that someone just listens and then makes a decision and then does exactly what needs to be done, which is the way mixing should be. So I totally get that, though, because it comes with experience. And if nobody ever taught you and you learned on your own in your bubble at home, like, how would you know? I totally get it. I've been there myself. Absolutely. Trust me. So I understand that. And that is the big reason for why we started what we do here at this platform. First of all, this podcast, but then also the coaching program, because we want you to stop figuring it out in a vacuum in your bubble with just YouTube. We want to show you these things, explain them to you, listen to your music, because again, context, and then help you make better decisions. Because once you hear it, once somebody tells you, hey, listen to this compared to this in the context of your song, or I hear this problem, try this, here's how to approach it, then you'll learn to listen that way and spot those problems, and then you'll be able to do it yourself next time. So if you're in the coaching program with us, for example, and you upload a song and a mix, and I tell you, you know what, that snare could be a little brighter, it would cut through better, and I would exactly boost, like in this case, this frequency by about that much, try that, and then let's upload again. And then you do it, you realize what I just said and it makes sense to you. And then next time you'll be able to make that decision yourself if it happens again. This is the big advantage of having coaching and feedback and guidance from mentors. This is how I learned. This is how everyone in the industry learned when they were interns or assistants or whatever. Nobody great who's really great at this has just learned it on their own in their living room or like home studio. Every single person has spent time next to someone else who has already done it. And that's how they learned. And I remember, Manel, you are a really great engineer and mixer. But when you came into the program a while ago, 1.5 years ago, or a little more than that now, your stuff already sounded great. But I remember that there were a couple of times where you uploaded things and I told you, hey, there's like whatever, like tiny things. This one a little bright, or here is it's a little muddy in the low mids. If you clean up this or that, there might be more space for this. And then you did it. And of course, you often said, well, that makes a difference. I just didn't hear it, but now I can hear it. And you often said, you can hear things now that you just weren't able to hear before. Mm-hmm. And that's the whole point. So I highly encourage you all to try that and at least get a plan, like what that could look like for you. So if that sounds interesting to you, go to the selfrecordingband.com and apply for mentoring. And if we look at this application and if we think we can help you, then we jump on a completely free call and we build a plan for you in your specific situation. And if you don't like that plan, you don't pay us anything. If you like that plan, then we can implement it together and we can do all the things that I just described. And when you're done with that, you'll be finally able to make intentional decisions and use the tools you have the way they are intended to, and that is to serve the song. So, yeah, the selfrecordingband.com. Manelito, anything to add to that?
No. Well, I don't know why, but I always say no, but the answer is yes. Like
yes.
Yeah, is that I remember when I started at the program and all that, we took 1,000 years to finish the first song, probably because of the drums, right? And the thing is that at first you would tell me, yeah, boost this, whatever. And I was like, yeah, I'll do it because Benedict says it, but I don't hear anything, you know? But over time, like by doing it over and over and over, there's a point where you start hearing things. And yeah, so you got to be patient and work on that on your ears, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Totally. Yeah. So, and then the other thing I need to mention this at in every episode is one thing that you do very well, Manel, is groove. I've said that a couple times before. And drums, grooves, beats, I don't know how to call it, but that like every time I listen to your music, I just, it just makes me move and makes me happy. And all those crazy percussion sounds that you mentioned, the field recordings, the unique textures you have in those songs. This is like one of your strengths, in my opinion. If you want to hear what I'm talking about, go to Manelito on Spotify, check out Manel's songs. And if you want something like that yourself for your songs and you don't know how to turn random sounds into drums or whatever, but you would like to experience that, go to manelitomusica.com and just hit Manelito up because he is able to do that with you and your songs. So I highly recommend that if you don't want to go it alone, but hire a producer to do it.
Yep.
All right. As always, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for staying with us through these long monologues again today. Sometimes these episodes, when I prepare them, I go on and on forever, but I also need to get to the point and through the episode to get the point across to you. Next time, it's going to be much less of me and much more of a guest that we have and also questions from both of us. So next week, we're going to have Matt Boudreau on our show, who has interviewed me on the Working Class Audio podcast. He's going to be on our show. And then we can ask him about things he's done on fantastic records he's worked on, because if you look up his discography, it's pretty impressive. We can talk about his studio at his home, where he has built a really nice Atmos room, if that's interesting to any of you. And then also what I'm really excited about is he has interviewed everyone in this industry, it feels like, on this podcast. So it's I was episode 550 something, I think. So, and before me were people like Andrew Sheps, Al Schmidt, whatever, like, Grammy winning, all the greatest of all times, basically. All of them have been on the show. And he has picked those people's brains, knows a lot of them personally, and is very well connected and has collected such a big amount of very diverse knowledge and perspectives over the years that I'm really, really excited to talk to Matt about all of this and get like kind of the common things that all of these massive producers and mixers, talk about. Maybe some things that everybody does differently, whatever. But I try to distill that down for you and pick Matt's brain on that, because he's a walking, encyclopedia of audio knowledge, basically, because of the podcast. And I look forward to that. So next week, Matt Boudreau on this show. Manel, be prepared.
Yeah. I've listened to some podcasts already.
Yeah. That's great, right? The conversations are cool. Yeah. All right. So looking forward to that. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.